know about ESLT, so I'm just quickly going to say that ESLT works in Inyo County, Mono County, Alpine County, just 9% of the state of California, and Western Nevada to protect private land. And that's land that willing landowners would like to protect for future generations. And we work with them to protect off cases so that they don't have to divide their larger ranches. We buy at fair market value their development rights, and then we extinguish them through a legal process. And this open land for future generations means that wildlife has their migration corridors, and that we, of course, have places to go play and recreate and find peace in. And I don't know about you, but I'm needing that open space and that peace in nature. It's a pretty challenging time. And I want to thank you all for taking time out of everything that you're doing with all of these challenges for joining us today. And hopefully we can just take a little time out from all of that and talk about gardening and talk about how to find peace in nature. I want to just introduce a couple people real quickly before I turn it over. And Marie, raise your hand. So that's Marie. Many of you have met her. She is our AmeriCorps member, Sierra Nevada AmeriCorps partnership member, and she is with us for a second term. AmeriCorps members, if you don't know much about them, are simply amazing. They inspire me every day. Oh, those who know, you know, it was almost there. I was almost going to cry. Basically, they give a year of service. It's a year of service. It's 40 hours a week for 10.5 months of service with an organization that they qualify for. And she has just been amazing, very nimble, very creative in taking what was a template for gatherings in person and turning everything over into virtual. So this is the beginning of it. There's been a lot of work behind the scenes, and we've got multiple series coming up with more in the works, as well as a book club that Maria is starting that she can talk more about. So I also want to introduce our guest speaker just briefly. Marie will go into more detail for her, but Sarah is a postdoctoral researcher, there she is up there, up at the University of Nevada, Reno, who studies stressors to pollinator health caused by global change. Oh geez, not much of that happening, right? So again, I just want to thank all of you for being with us, and I don't know if any of you are or if your family members are. I want to make sure that we give a shout out to any of the first line, front line workers and caregivers. They're giving their all for us. Oh gosh, geez. And I just want to send thanks to everybody who knows anybody who's doing that. So Marie, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll step in the background and go on mute and help in any way I can. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Kay. Before I turn things over to Sarah, I just wanted to share a little bit about our Eastside Pollinator Garden project. This is one of my main projects I've been working on the past years, and honestly one of my favorite parts of my AmeriCorps term. But basically, as a part of our pollinator garden project, we work with community members like all of you to help certify gardens as pollinator friendly. And basically the process for that is there's usually an initial garden visit, which this year we're looking at doing a virtual format. But there's usually an initial garden visit where we'll go over the project, go over the certification criteria, come up with a fun plan for your garden, and then help you with any other resources you need. And then after that, there's usually a check-in visit in which I would, on a normal year, would come to your garden and make sure the criteria is met with everything but the plants in the grounds, like the water conservation measures were in place, anything like that. And then after that, if you've met all the requirements, you would get a voucher for California Native Plant Society fall plant sale. And then following that, there would be a final visit where you'd get a certification plaque. And that's a very, very brief overview of our Eastside Pollinator Garden project. I'm happy to talk with anyone more afterwards or when we have time for questions about the specifics of that process. So that is our pollinator garden project. And I also really want to thank our funder for both the project and this workshop. And Metabolic Studio has graciously sponsored the Pollinator Project this year, which is very exciting. And I also want to thank our partners. We work a lot with California Native Plant Society, Inyo Mono Master Gardeners, Eastern Sierra Audubon Society, and University of Nevada, Reno, with Sarah. And that is what I have for our pollinator garden project. I want to turn it over to Sarah so she has the full amount of time. As Kay mentioned, Sarah is a postdoctoral researcher from the University of Nevada, Reno. Her research evaluates pollinator responses to stresses induced by global change. Specifically, she's looked at the effects of diet and pesticides on bumblebee physiology, foraging behavior, survival, and colony population dynamics. She's received several awards and scholarships for her work, published 8 papers, and has also done incredible work on diversity and inclusion in STEM, which is science, technology, education, engineering, and math, and has done youth science outreach. And without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Sarah, who's going to be presenting about pollinator health today.
Great, thank you, Marie, for that really lovely introduction. So I've prepared a PowerPoint, and I'll sort of talk along while I'm sharing the slides, generally about pollinator health and some of the issues that specifically bees face because of factors relating to global change. So bear with me while I share my screen and get this going. Slideshow from start. Great, okay. And let me change a thing here. Okay, great. So hopefully everybody can hear and see me okay. And fingers crossed we don't have too many tech difficulties. And so we can go ahead and get started. So I'll be talking, answering this question of how do bees stay healthy and how can we help them? We go. So first, I just wanted to thank everybody for logging on and doing this virtual meeting. I know that we were originally supposed to do a big in-person day back in April, and of course that couldn't happen. And there's a lot going on right now, and so I really thank everybody for taking the time to do this virtual meeting to hear about pollinators. So I'm going to start off the talk by sort of giving a general overview about bees and talk about some of the threats that they face, and then go on into more detail about some of the research that we do at the University of Nevada, and I'll also be highlighting some other work from some of our colleagues at other institutions. So first, I really like sort of starting with a slide that shows photos of all these different species of bees. Very often when we think about bees, we tend to think of, for example, the European honeybee that has a queen and, tens of thousands of workers that live in this big colony. And in reality, when it comes to bees, that's actually more the exception than the rule. And there's actually about 20,000 species of bees worldwide, and about 1,600 of those can be found in California. And then rather than this life history where you have a queen and lots of workers, most of those bee species are actually solitary, so just individual bees doing their thing. Some of them will live in small groups together, but more often than not, bees are solitary rather than social, although there are also lots of species of social bees. And we also see this really wonderful diversity of colors and shapes, and being fuzzy and not fuzzy, and having long antennae and short antennae. So this is something I just really like to start out with and share, and you'll see a lot of these different types of bees in your garden if you look closely. Another thing about bees, we often think about, oh, bees sting, and yes, that's true. Many bee species will sting you if provoked. Many are not that aggressive. But a lot of these bee species generally won't sting you, even though they do have very small stingers, or they'd sting you, but it wouldn't be too uncomfortable. And there are some that actually don't sting at all. And so it's been in the news a lot recently, and a big topic of conversation is that there are threats to bee populations worldwide, and that's definitely true. And this is where I like to make another distinction between the European honeybee that's seen here in the photo on the top. I don't know if I can highlight. Yeah, I sort of can. Sort of a bee in an urban environment here. Sort of has overlapping, but it's distinct set of problems from all of these other species of bees that I was talking about previously. So when you hear, for example, colony collapse disorder, that's something that's specific to the European honeybee. The other sort of diversity of bee species face other types of threats. A really big one is loss of habitat. And so that goes for nesting habitat and foraging habitat. So access to nests and access to flowers through land use change and urbanization, et cetera. And I've shown this map of the eastern United States and this bumblebee here that is the rusty patched bumblebee. And it's found in this range highlighted in green here on the map. And it's actually been recently listed as an endangered species. And a big reason of that is because of it losing its habitat in that range. Disease is another big factor threatening bee populations. There are a lot of parasites and bacterial infections and fungal infections that are really harmful for bee populations. Pesticide exposure is another really big one, and one that I'll spend time focusing on today. That bees will end up consuming pesticides that are applied in agricultural fields and in people's yards and in other sort of public areas. And there's a lot of research showing the negative consequences of that. And then climate change, either directly through bees' ability to tolerate heat as the climate warms up, to the way that climate change just sort of interacts with all of these different factors that on this list. So I'll focus on a couple of these, mostly topics related to disease and pesticide exposure, and talking about how those factors affect bee health. And so how do bees stay healthy? So just like humans, bees need to maintain a healthy diet to support their bodily functions and their immune system. And so a healthy diet for bees means a lot of nectar and pollen found in flowers. And so you can see here, I have the photo on the left where a bee is covered in pollen. And on the right, you can see this other bee is drinking some nectar from a flower. And I'll sort of go over the ways in which both nectar and pollen contribute to a healthy diet for bees. Let's see, okay. And so this is the focus of the research that we do at the University of Nevada, Reno, and we broadly ask how diet and pesticide exposure work together to affect bee health and survival. And we do this mostly using bumblebees, although some of our work, we do work with other local species here in the Sierra Nevadas and some solitary bee species. We do a mixture of work in the lab, so you can see some of the evidence of that in some of these pictures here. You see some bees and little tubes here in the center where we were doing an experiment with them in the lab. And then also work in the field, which you can see here, 2 field assistants who've worked with us over the summers. Whoops, are we advancing? There we go. Okay, so the essentials of a healthy diet for bees are somewhat similar to the essentials of a healthy diet for humans. So a big one is macronutrients, so proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. And then what I call secondary chemistry. And I'll go into this in more detail in a little bit, but the way that I think about secondary chemistry is like for humans, right? We need our proteins, our carbohydrates and fats, but we also need like vitamins and sort of extra stuff that we get from our food. And secondary chemistry is sort of the bee equivalent of that. And then also, you know, when we want to stay healthy with our diet, we tend to avoid environmental toxins. And this is equally true for bees, that they need to avoid those toxins in their diet in order to stay healthy. So macronutrients, like I said, carbohydrates, proteins, and fat They get these from what we call floral rewards, is a sort of catch-all term that we use when we're talking about nectar and pollen. And so bees will actually eat both nectar and pollen from flowers to get these different macronutrients. So nectar is really rich in carbohydrates. It's essentially just sugary water. And so this is great for bees to drink, whereas the pollen is higher in proteins and fats. And so they can get their macronutrients that way through eating the pollen. And here's just some great photos of bees consuming both nectar and pollen. And so this is, when pollination is happening in your garden, or in agriculture, is really just the process of these bees going about their business, feeding on the nectar and pollen. And then you can see the pollen gets all over the bees. And then when they go to the next flower, some of it rubs off, and then the plants reproduce that way. And so the one thing we study in the lab is sort of the ratio of macronutrients that bees have in their diet. And we're finding that their needs, their nutritional needs sort of change over the course of their lifetime. So for example, in the bottom corner here, here's a photo of the different developmental stages of a honeybee. So it starts as a larva and then turns into a pupa and will eventually emerge as an adult. And the larvae need a lot of protein. And so one thing that is happening, like if you look in your garden and you see a bee collecting pollen from a flower, often that bee is bringing that pollen back to the nest to feed to the larvae that really need pollen for that developmental process. Foraging adults, like this big bumblebee we see here in the photo, they need a lot of carbohydrates, a lot of sugar to fuel the flight when they're flying those long distances. So adults also need a good mix of sugar in their diet so that they can make those foraging trips. And then female adults use their fat reserves when they're laying eggs. So egg laying is a very energetically costly process. And so it's good for them to have a lot of fat in their diet so they have fat on their body to be able to better facilitate that process. Some bees also hibernate through the winter. So bumblebee queens will do this, where bumblebee queens are kind of born out of the colony at the end of the summer growing season, and then they mate, and then they live the whole winter in hibernation, and then they'll emerge the next spring and start their own nests. And so it's critical for these queens to have a lot of fat reserves from their diet so that they can live off of those fat reserves while they're hibernating. And so another thing we focus on in the lab is looking at the diversity of plants that bees visit, and we can collect the nectar and pollen from these plants and run chemical analyses on them. And then we're able to see that the macronutrients offered by the flowers of different plant species are actually different. And so there's sort of this variation in dietary availability across different plant species. So some flowers, for instance, provide, both nectar and pollen. Some flowers provide only pollen and not nectar, and some flowers provide only nectar and not pollen. In pollen, we also find if you were to sample pollen from a bunch of different plant species and run an analysis to look at the ratio of fat and protein in the nectar, that actually really differs too, which is particularly interesting because different species of bees, like I talked about how sort of over development, bees need different ratios of macronutrients. But this is also true across different species of bees. Well, so one species of bee might just generally need more protein as opposed to fat, and another may need more fat as opposed to protein. And we're finding that bees would then preferentially visit the flowers that are going to offer that ratio that works for them. And so this is a figure from a paper recently published out of our lab. And there's a lot going on in the figure, but so there's a list here that lists all these different plant families. And if you see on the horizontal axis, this is how much fat is found in the pollen of a plant from that family after running a chemical analysis on it. And then on the vertical axis, we look at the amount of protein the pollen has. And so we can see that the different plant families sort of fall broadly across this spectrum. And then bees will choose what plants they want to consume floral resources from, partially based on what their needs are and sort of what ratio works best for them. Okay, so moving on from macronutrients to what I mentioned, secondary chemistry. So this is sort of the bee equivalent of like having vitamins on top of macronutrients in your diet. So plants produce a lot of chemicals, right, in all of their tissues, the leaves as well as the flowers, and this is beneficial for humans as well. So like one of the reasons basil is so fragrant and tasty is because all the chemical content in the leaves. Often these are evolved responses to herbivores, so animals that are going to eat the plant tissues. Cannabis is another example of that. So THC is actually an evolved response to keep herbivores off of the plant. And then obviously humans have figured out a use for that as well. The flower picture I have on the bottom is foxgloves. So if you read like mystery novels and stuff, you'll hear or read about, one character poisoning another using foxgloves. And so there's a lot of chemicals found in the foxglove nectar as well. And so these chemicals, even the ones in the leaf tissue, they will work their way often into the floral nectar, and they're consumed by bees. And so there's a big sort of subtopic within the field of pollination biology looking at this secondary chemistry in floral nectar and its effect on pollinators. And so not only is there secondary chemistry, but also if we think of flowers and floral nectar, there's these sort of warm, wet, sugary environment. It's perfect for the growth of bacteria and yeast. And so there's a lot of other work also looking at how bacteria and yeast in nectar will change the chemical environment, and then how that scales up to affect bees. Okay, so secondary chemistry when it comes to bees is sort of a blessing and a curse. The studies that we work on sort of looking at the effects of secondary chemistry on bees shows that some of these chemicals can really improve bee health, but some can be highly toxic, or some in low concentrations can be helpful, but once they get to a high concentration, it can be harmful. So an example here in the photo, this flower is a citrus flower. I'm not sure exactly what kind, but an orange maybe. And citrus flowers very commonly contain caffeine in the nectar, as again, just sort of a byproduct of the plant physiology. And so I'll show some results of a study done by some colleagues in England. And what this figure is showing, so the experiment that they did is they gave bumblebees, was it bumblebees or honeybees? Maybe it was honeybees, a sugar solution in the lab so they could drink from an artificial nectar. And either this nectar just had sugar and water, or it had sugar and water that was supplemented with caffeine. And then a cool thing you can do with bees in the lab is train them to visit artificial flowers. And so what they did is they trained the bees to visit artificial flowers under these two diets, and then asked how long a bee could remember what that flower was and return and visit it again. And so the orange bars are much higher across time. So we're looking at how often the bee remembers the flower at 10 minutes, at 24 hours, and at 72 hours. And the bees that had caffeine in their diet were a lot more likely to remember the flowers, indicating that caffeine somehow improves the cognitive functioning for bees and improves their memory a little bit. So there's an example of a way in which nectar chemistry can be really helpful for bees. Here's another study that my supervisor at UNR was an author of this, an author on this paper. And here they're showing that secondary chemistry can reduce parasite load in bumblebees. So there's a bacterial parasite called Crithidia that's really harmful for bees. And so what they did for this experiment is, again in the lab, gave bees a sugar solution that didn't have any secondary chemistry in it, or then they tested these eight different commonly studied nectar chemicals and looked at whether consuming those chemicals reduced the parasite load in the bees. And so the farther the dot and whisker is from the 0 line, the greater the reduction in the parasite load. So we can see sort of in starting from the biggest reduction to the least reduction that a lot of these nectar chemicals can be really effective at reducing parasite load in bees. So it's a really exciting finding, and indicates ways in which we might be able to counteract some of these negative effects on bee populations. But there is a flip side to the secondary chemistry. So this is a study done by some of our colleagues showing that in the same experimental setup where bees either had just sugar, and in this case a cardinalide, which for example, is a type of chemical found in those foxglove flowers. These are also highly present in milkweeds, the cardinalides. That when they consumed them, they laid fewer eggs. So this is sort of this blessing and a curse where, depending on the chemical, sometimes it can be really helpful and, great vitamins to have in addition to the macronutrients. But sometimes it can be problematic and harmful for bees. So toxic nectar occurs naturally in flowers sometimes. Sometimes it's helpful when these different nectar chemicals occur in flowers. But it's not the only way bees consume toxins. So I wanted to move on to the third sort of essential of the bee diet, which is avoiding these environmental toxins. And this is where I'll focus on pesticides and some of the work in the lab that we're doing looking at the effect of pesticides. So pesticides, it may not be surprising to learn, are highly toxic to bees. And this is something we read a lot about in the news, where specifically these neonicotinoid pesticides, which is a specific type of pesticide, they're a neurotoxin, which is my understanding is that is part of why they're so effective, is because they work on all different types of insects because they work at the level of the brain. But then the side effect of that is that they'll also affect the bees. And neonics are pretty widely used both in industrial agriculture, like seen here in the top photo, either sprayed onto plants or the seeds will be treated with the pesticide. But they're systemic throughout the plant. And so even if they're not sprayed directly onto the flowers, they will work their way into the pollen and nectar and are then consumed by the bees. This is also true for plants, whole plant species that aren't the target of the pesticide. So for example, in this agricultural field here, if there was, say, a patch of wildflowers growing adjacent to the field, the neonic solutions are really soluble in water, and so they'll work their way through the soil and be taken up by a neighboring plant species, and then also consumed by bees there. And one thing we're finding is that at least bumblebees seem not to be able to smell or taste the chemicals, which makes it difficult because they'll unknowingly ingest them and won't necessarily know to avoid them. And the harm that the neonics cause the bees is really extreme. In the past 15 years, we've seen a whole lot of research come out showing the negative effects on reproduction, on their ability to forage for food, on their ability to fight infections. And it's a really, really harmful thing for the bees. And we see this in nature and we see this in the lab, sort of these symptoms of neonic toxicity. They have poor foraging, little energy, like they do actually look really sick. Some work that we do in the lab where we'll feed a bee the pesticide in its sucrose diet, they'll slow down, they forage really slowly, they'll stop moving altogether, they kind of like flip on their backs and like stick their tongue out and are immobile for like a couple of days, which incidentally, that's what they look like after they die, like flipped on their back with their tongue lolling out. I mentioned decreased reproduction. And one thing, and a brand new finding out of the lab, is that when bees consume these neonics, they're actually less able to tolerate heat. So this is a study being conducted by Isabel Malouf, who's a post-baccalaureate technician in the lab, and she's like a total superstar. And she developed a really cool study where she's kept bees either on a diet of just regular sugar water as a nectar or sugar water that has the neonic in it. And then she took the bees and she put them in this thermal environment where they're gradually heating up. And then she uses a thermal camera to actually take the bees' temperature during that process. And what she's finding is that the bees that consume the neonics heat up much faster and heat up to a larger degree than the bees that don't consume the neonics, indicating that, say, in response to global warming as the planet heats up, or sort of more extreme weather events, extreme heat events, that when bees are consuming these neonics, they're going to be less able to tolerate that increase in heat. Similarly, so this is some work that I've been leading, looking at the combined effects of those secondary chemicals, the secondary chemistry that I was talking about earlier, and the neonics on bees. And so again, there's sort of a lot going on in this figure, but the experimental setup here is similar to the rest, except this time they're given either just plain sugar water with just a neonic, sugar water with just one of these naturally occurring nectar chemicals. And so this time I chose thymol because this is one of the chemicals that was shown to reduce parasite load in the bees. And it's found in like thyme flowers and oregano flowers and stuff that bees really like. So they had either just sugar, just the neonic, just thymol, or they had both the thymol and the neonic. And what we did is we looked at survival under these different diets. So we measured how long bees could live when this is presented to them as their diet. And so what the figure is showing is all of the different combinations, with the exception of having both chemicals together. There isn't really much of a difference in how long the bees are surviving. So the red line here is a situation where they don't have any thymol in their diet, and then either they do not have the neonic or they do. And even though we see a slight increase here, actually, which was a little surprising, when they do consume the neonic, the margin of error here is such that there's really no discernible difference between the neonic and the non-neonic treatments here in terms of how long bees are able to live. Similarly, so here with the blue line, this is when they have the thymol in their diet. And here on the left-hand side, hopefully people can see my cursor. I'm circling here the point where they just have the thymol and not the neonic. And again, their longevity is about the same. However, when they have both at once, thymol and the neonic in their sugar solution, their survival is reduced by the order of an average of about 3 days, which, considering an adult bumblebee, this is all done with bumblebees, an adult bumblebee in nature lives about 3 weeks. A 3-day reduction in your lifespan is a pretty big deal for them. And so this is indicating that there may be a sort of toxicity overload situation that happens, where if they just have a little bit of neonic in their diet or a little bit of thymol in their diet, they're able to tolerate it. But once they have those two chemicals together, the effects can become very harmful. So I've just shared a lot of sort of depressing information about bees and bee health and what's happening to bees globally. And so I'd like to flip it around a little bit and end on more of a positive note, that yeah, bees are facing a lot of health issues, but there are a lot of ways that we can help out and, keep enjoying the bee diversity and the pollination services that we get. And so some big ones that, everybody who's, logged on to the meeting here is probably already knows this, but, supporting local conservation efforts. So the more land available for bees, they have more of this diversity. of plant resources, and this particularly speaks to the fact that, you know, they actually do need a diverse array of plant species in order to sort of completely fulfill their nutritional needs. Support pesticide-free agriculture if you can, so like buying organic produce, which, you know, is more expensive than conventional produce for the most part, and not everybody's able to do it, but if it's something you're able to do, it is really helpful in terms of protecting pollinators, and engaging with pollinator initiatives. So, you know, organizations like Eastern Sierra Land Trust that has a whole pollinator initiative. There's an organization called the Xerces Society, spelled Xerces, and they do a lot of pollinator awareness and conservation nationwide. They have a cool program where they'll designate cities as official bee cities when they have sort of considerable pollinator conservation efforts citywide. And then of course you can also help bees in your own garden. And so like the pollinator certification program that Marie mentioned before I started giving this presentation is a really great example for that. And honestly, their website and information about the program is really kind of the gold standard in terms of gardening for bee health. And so anything you might want to know is on the website. And yeah, some sort of big takeaways: different species of wildflowers so bees can access a variety of nutrients. Leaving bare ground for nesting habitat is a big one. I haven't talked much about nesting in this presentation, but a lot of bees, and actually the majority of the bees that you'll find in the Eastern Sierras, nest in the ground. And so you can buy the wood blocks and the little bee houses, and those are definitely helpful. But leaving patches of bare ground is also really helpful for a lot of those ground nesting bees, where they'll have a nesting habitat, and if it's in your garden, they'll have a bonus of nesting really close to their food sources. Obviously, the last one is avoiding the use of pesticides, even on non-wildflower plants, because like I mentioned, they're so water soluble, and so they can inadvertently make it into plants that the bees might visit. And I'll just reiterate that, yeah, the ESLT's pollinator garden program really has all the information you need to know. So hopefully you've learned a little bit something about bees and what you can do to help them and some of the issues they face. Thank you again for taking the time to join this virtual webinar, and for ESLT for hosting me, and I'm happy to take any questions.
We do have one question in the chat, Sarah. And that's, I have seen a native bee nesting house, which is made of a set of 20 tubes, each 8 inches long, bundled into a 2x2 inch structure. Can you explain how the structure invites local native bees?
Yeah, so sure, like I've seen those little A-frames with all the tubes in them. I would say sort of intrinsically, there isn't a whole lot of that, like a broad advertisement for the bees from that structure. But what's really nice is that it provides a really easy access point for bees to make a nest. So rather than, especially in, say, a more urban landscape where there might not be a lot of trees or fallen logs, and particularly old trees that have holes in them that bees can sort of wiggle their way into and make a nest, that those bee houses sort of provide a easily available nesting habitat. You can do some things like if you face them south, you can make them south facing so they get a lot of sun. That can be helpful in making bees more attracted to them. Let's see, other questions? Yeah, it looks like. So yeah, I guess people just unmute themselves and ask your question, I guess is how we'll do it, or yeah.
Hi, Sarah. I'm Annalise, and this is my daughter, Issa, here. We would like to start a little bee habitat in our garden, and I'm wondering, like you said, to plant a diverse array of plant species is important. Do you recommend clover for them? What's their favorite food? What would be a good nutritional food aside from wildflowers?
Yeah, bees definitely love clover. It's really nectar rich, so they like that. I'm not positive about the secondary chemistry of clover flowers, but in terms of a floral resource, yeah, bees love it.
And if it's not a floral resource, do they like, but it needs a flower for them, right? I mean, they don't like just plants. They need to have a flower on them, right?
Correct, yeah. So the pollen and nectar exclusively comes from the flowers. There's a couple of exceptions. So some bees will collect like resin from plants and they'll use that in the nests. Honeybees can use it actually as an antimicrobial sort of coating in their nest. And other bees called leafcutter bees will then cut off bits of leaves and bring them back to sort of build their nests. So they will use the non-flower tissues in some cases, but in terms of their diet, yeah, it's from the flowers.
And Sarah, what's your opinion of these like bee houses that, you know, sort of stacked wooden boxes that I've seen online? Are they beneficial? Do the bees like them? You can usually put a colony in there. Do they stay there or do they fly away? What do they do?
Yeah, so those are more meant for the solitary species that tend to be annual or live for about 2 years. And so if they nest in there, you'd expect them to be there for a year or two. I think the bee houses are good. I do know there is some criticism of them in that they could also invite wasp species or, you know, other critters that you may or may not want in your garden as well, and that you do need to be sure that they stay clean. And so you can use an all natural cleaner like Simple Green is one that we use in the lab, just to make sure that there aren't bacteria and fungi breeding in the nest that might be harmful.
How do you see if wasps are in there?
Yeah, so you can see it depending on how big the tubes are, it can be kind of difficult to see whether they're occupied at all or what's in there, but some of it is just from watching and you can see what comes and goes from the nest. You can take, what we do actually, I have research colleagues who use these nesting blocks for their research and they have one of those really small like pen flashlights and you can sort of shine it in at such an angle that you can maybe see what's going on out there.
All right.
Cool.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's see. And we've got a few going on in the chat here. Is dandelion still all the rave in terms of what to plant for bees? Yeah, I think bees like dandelions just fine. They're, you know, they can be kind of weedy and, you know, I guess I don't have a strong opinion as to whether or not you want dandelions in your garden. Yeah. Avoiding neonics, what brand name should I avoid? Oh, geez. You know, this is something I should have more sort of present at the front of my head. I tend to know the names of the active ingredients, the chemicals. So imidacloprid is one, clothidionin is one. Yeah, I mean, you could look at the back of the bottle and see if it lists some of those chemical names. But in terms of the brand names, I really don't have a good grasp on what the brand names are, unfortunately. But I think you could it's pretty easily, you know, you can Google search it and find the sort of, things you'd buy at Home Depot, like what the label name would be and know to avoid those.
Sarah, after the presentation, would you just send us those names and then we can distribute the names to everybody? That I think would be a little helpful for us too.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thanks.
A lot of information about the murder hornets and being a risk about the honeybees. What have I heard? Yeah, so if anybody hasn't read about the murder hornets, hornets are wasps and they are these giant wasps that originated in Asia and have lived in Asia for a long time and have recently been spotted in the Pacific Northwest in Washington State. And their life history is pretty extreme in that the way they feed, they have the name murder hornets because they specialize on eating honeybees. And what they do is they search out the nests, the big hives, and they'll find the nest and they'll descend upon the nest, decapitate the bees, eat the bees. They'll take the bee larvae and bring them home to their nest to feed to their larvae. And it does sound like they can like really decimate a honeybee colony. Honeybees in Asia have developed a pretty ingenious way of dealing with a hornet invasion. If they, say, catch one of the scouts coming looking for the hive, that they'll surround the hornet and they'll all sort of surround it and buzz together. And what that does is it builds a lot of heat, and it also builds carbon dioxide. And often that combination will kill the wasp. So that may be something that they can do here as well. I don't know how long it took them to evolve that response, or if it's a behavior they can just sort of, you know, come up with without having to evolve the behavior. Also, I know, so similar, like beekeepers will have queen excluders in the colonies to keep sort of other colonies' queens from getting in. And they can do a similar wasp excluder. So that would work for commercial beekeepers. In terms of feral colonies, yeah, I mean, so the sort of state of the science in terms of my colleagues working on this in the US is it is a potentially a pretty big threat for honeybees, but not one that, you know, is, it might not be completely devastating. We might find ways to deal with it. In terms of their risk to humans, it's really overblown in the news, in my opinion, and people don't necessarily have to be worried about the hornets for their personal harm. Obviously, you don't want to go around provoking wasps, but if you see one, just sort of stay away from it. You'll probably be okay. How do wasps in one's yard affect bee populations? So in a few ways. So some wasps are carnivorous and may eat different bee species. So that's one sort of direct way in which they could affect the bee populations. They're also just pretty aggressive and defensive of their territories. So depending on how the wasps nest, they may compete with bees for nesting habitat, or just because they're sort of a big presence and very aggressive, they may cause bees to stay away from whatever area that is. And so if it happens to be near like a really rich floral patch, it might be a difficult situation for the bee to try to visit that patch if there's a lot of wasps present. Any new information about Africanized bees? Yeah, so this is a something that has happened. So the whole backstory behind the Africanized bees is the Apis mellifera is the Latin name for what we call the European honeybee. And it's not native to the Americas at all. And it was brought over to North America in, I think, the mid-1800s to use in agriculture. And it was brought to South America about 100 years later for the same purpose. And then what happened is as so you have the managed colonies, but then you get feral colonies, of course, that sort of offshoot from the managed colonies. And then those go through their own evolutionary cycles. And it just so happens that the bees that are, so it's the same species of bee, and it's different sort of subspecies, if you will. And just what happens is the evolutionary history of this South American population, and I guess it's called Africanized because the bees originate, so Apis mellifera, deep evolutionary history, originated kind of in the Middle East, and then so there are populations in Africa. And my understanding is that the populations from Africa are the ones that were brought to South America. And so throughout their evolutionary history in South America, they've become sort of more aggressive. And that's really the big thing, is this aggressive behavior. And then just through sort of normal range expansion and also with climate change, the bees are moving farther and farther northward. And so then you end up like, I used to live in Tucson, Arizona, and you know, hear stories about populations of Africanized bees being found there. And, you know, my opinion about Africanized bees is you would actually have to, like, you wouldn't know looking at one if you saw one. You'd have to take it back to a lab and look at its genetic code, look at its genome to know if it was an Africanized bee. They're definitely problematic. I know, like just today, a colleague in Tucson shared on Twitter that bee swarms have killed a few dogs today in Tucson, and there's sort of an alert about it. So it's not something to take lightly, but at the same time, it's not a sort of global threat that sometimes it's posed to be. Let's see, specific flower shape and color that bumblebees are attracted to. Yeah, so bumblebees, just because of the way that their vision works, they tend to see really well in the sort of blue to purple spectrum. So they really like blue and purple flowers. And in terms of shapes, bumblebees they're definitely attracted to any sort of disc type shape in general, and because it has a nice contrast against a green background. But also for nectar specifically, because bumblebees tend to have these really long tongues, they like these sort of deep flowers. So flowers with those nectar spurs on them, like delphiniums have those, or larkspurs. Larkspur is delphinium. They also like bluebells, hortensias, so things that have those nectar spurs in them. So they can, penstemon, somebody just said they like penstemon. Yeah, so I heard there's some risk of bees in almond orchards or just the issue of a monocrop. Yeah, well, so, and I'm not as much of an expert on that, but my understanding is that almonds are actually specialized for honeybees. And so the problem with issues like colony collapse disorder is that it's going to be harmful for almond crops, because honeybees happen to be a really effective pollinator, specifically of almonds. The fact that almonds tend to grow in a monoculture certainly isn't helpful, because one thing we're finding is that floral diversity can sort of ward against some of these factors that contribute to colony collapse disorder. Seed mixes, should we stick with Sierra Nevada blends or their pollinator bill? Yeah, and this is sort of a use at your own discretion. I know there's, definitely you want to use native plants when you can, but there are a lot of plant species, say pollinator friendly species, that, might not be native to the Eastern Sierras, but they don't, they're not going to be invasive. You could safely keep them in your garden without risking them spreading out to the outside world. And so in that case, I don't think it's too much of a problem. Yeah.
One quick thing I want to add to that is at least last year they had it. I'm not sure if they have it this year, but Chalfont Big Trees had a really nice local seed mix with a lot of plants that are great for pollinators and are local to this area. So if anyone is in Bishop, Chalfont Big Trees would be a place to check out for that.
Is there a good time to start a hive, like an ideal time? So springtime, I would say. Again, I know sort of less about the honeybee side of things, and I will actually provide some somewhat controversial information, is that in the sort of bee science world, there is the argument that keeping a honeybee hive can be harmful for native bees. And this argument sort of about native species, and the argument that because honeybees aren't actually native to the Americas, that if you wanted to help bees, it might be a better idea to do things like create pollinator habitat in your garden, like ESLT is doing with their certification program. There's studies coming out showing that some of these, like colony collapse disorder, is sort of a catch-all phrase for a lot of different types of afflictions, including some diseases that we're finding can be spread between honeybees to some of the native bees. That being said, if you want to be a beekeeper, you want honey, you like the practice of it, I think springtime is probably a good time to start a hive. I think if you can also do a thing where you can sign up. There are professionals out there who will catch feral swarms when they're swarming. So when a bee swarm happens, there's a queen in the center of all the workers, and they're looking for a new nest. And so people will collect up that swarm and put them in a hive box. And you can, like often on Craigslist, people will be advertising that. I guess right now is maybe like not the best time to be engaging in that, but I would say online beekeeping resources would give you the most information you want to know there. I live next to
Probably one more question, Sarah, and then we'll,
yeah.
unless people want to.
Okay, cool. So let's see. Live next to a natural meadow in Mammoth. Wonder about getting info and making sure anything I plant doesn't spread into the habitat. Yeah. So I think just sort of doing research on what you are planting and sort of its life history and whether it has the potential to become invasive would be sort of the best thing that I would recommend. And again, I think, you know, like ESLT would have a lot of really good information for you about that.
Sarah, this
yeah.
is, can I pop in? Wendy had raised her hand a little bit ago, and I want to make sure we can pop her in. Hopefully there'll be time for this other question about monarchs, because they're really important too.
Yeah.
Wendy, go ahead. Uh-oh. She left right then. Wendy?
Oh, maybe, was she waving goodbye maybe?
Maybe she was waving goodbye. I thought she was waving for a thing. I apologize. Can you tell us about monarchs?
Yeah. Yeah, do you also know about other pollinators? A lot of attention to the monarchs. There is, and I can, maybe I'll say one little quick thing about monarchs. Monarchs are super cool. Their life history and their migration pattern is just fascinating. This actually ties in with the pesticide work. So we have a colleague at Tufts University in Boston who also collaborates with folks at UC Davis. And they do a lot of really interesting mathematical modeling of what happens with monarch populations and what is leading to the declines, right? So we've read there's eastern monarchs and western monarchs, and both populations are declining, but western monarchs in the past couple of years have seen a reduction in about like 80% of their population has just crashed. And so they're investigating some of what's like the drivers of that. And what they found is in the eastern populations, they can link it to habitat loss, so they don't have access to the milkweeds that they need for the larval development as a host plant. In the west, the strongest predictor is actually use of neonic pesticides. So this neonic problem expands past bees and into monarchs too. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much for your great questions. This was really fun.
Yeah, great questions. Marie, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you
Awesome.
so much, Sarah.
Yeah, huge thank you to you, Sarah, and huge thank you to everyone who participated in this. Love seeing so many faces. Real quick, I just wanted to share some information about our upcoming workshops. Our next one is going to be next Saturday. Sorry. Our next one's going to be next Saturday, and it's going to be about water conservation and setting up a drip irrigation system. And I'll leave this up for a few minutes. This has the rest of our workshop series in it. And then, as Kay mentioned at the beginning of this, we are starting a new Happy Place book club. And our book club is going to be kicked off on June 2nd. And the first book we're going to be reading is Braiding Sweetgrass, which is also available for anyone in Bishop. It's available for order at Spellbinders, and we definitely encourage supporting local businesses right now. And Kay, did you want to say anything about the In Harmony?
Stay tuned for that if you're interested. We had a series of concerts called In Harmony in collaboration with the Methodist Church across the street from our office here in Bishop. We held one conference, which was before the stay-at-home orders. So we're hoping that the June 28th we'll be able to do it again, but we'll just wait and see. We're also working on, it might be a virtual one, so which will be free to the community.
Cool. Yeah, if anyone would like more information on any of these, feel free to reach out to me, and we hope you'll see you for the next workshop.
Thanks so much for coming, you guys. Thank you. Thank you.